Welcome to the F50 Woman Podcast, dedicated to sharing stories from a diverse community of women in order to provoke you into a passionate pursuit of life, build unshakable character, and achieve extraordinary things. Now, here is your host, Julia Jack.
As a young girl, she was an idealist, naive, and resistant to staying in any job for any extended period of time. She had a passion for theater and a talent with the written word. Born in the United States, she would eventually and unexpectedly be called overseas to her greatest adventure and to the love of her life. She started out in Massachusetts, then on to Vermont, then to Ohio, and on to Washington State, then to New York City, and to New Jersey, then back to New York, then on to Yemen, then Bolivia, and she's now sharing her life with us from Uzbekistan. She's an award-winning author and journalist, and a complete joy to speak with. Please join me as I chat with Jennifer Steil, another incredibly resilient F50 woman. Hey, F50 woman. Thank you for joining us. I am here today with Jennifer Steil, and she is an award-winning author, a journalist, and a teacher. And she has been in places in the world that I can only imagine. And I can't wait to hear about her journey. I can't wait for her to share it with you all. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
I was reading about you and I was like, what is that like? Because I've pretty much lived in the Northeast pretty much all of my life. My parents are West Indian. I was born in Canada, but pretty much since I was 10, I was in the Northeast. So that is what I know, except for a little bit of visits to Barbados and Florida and typical kind of trips. So I was just so fascinated by how your journey happened and what you started out like. And that's what I'd love to start with. What were you like as a young woman? What did you want to be? Who were you?
Well, I'll first start out by saying that I did originate from the Northeast, so your part of the world, from a small town in Massachusetts.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah, so that's where I grew up as a child. But so as a young woman, I was a theater major as an undergraduate, and so I was interested in becoming an actor. In fact, I was determined to become an actor. And I moved to Seattle to begin my acting career because I was too intimidated by New York City, and Seattle had a thriving theater scene, and I'd never been there. And so I drove across country to become an actor in Seattle. And as a young woman, I was very idealistic and a little bit naive, but very independent. I got very impatient with any job that required me to work regular hours.
Okay.
So I was extremely impoverished. I was living on, I think, $5,000 a year without debt at the time.
Wow.
The debt happened later when I went to grad school, but this is before that. But so I was a barista and a waitress, and I sorted recycling crates and put corks in wine bottles and did pretty much every kind of random blue collar job you could do in Seattle that didn't require a long-term commitment. And anytime a temp job would say, we want to hire you on a full-time basis, I'd say, look at the time. I have to go. My dog's on fire. So that's who I was. I was mostly performing in the theater. I was involved with creative communities. I loved being in Seattle. I loved being in the city and the mountains. I loved exploring. I did dream about living abroad then, but living abroad seemed to be something that only very wealthy people could do. People who inherited wealth or married wealth. And on $5,000 a year, I wasn't even taking vacations. So I just didn't know how people ended up living abroad. I didn't understand that there were jobs that would take you there or where to find those jobs. I just didn't have the resources.
Mm-hmm.
So I just worked as an actor and did a bunch of other jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I was in my early 20s.
So who are you now? Tell us about what you do, who you are, what you're like. Give us the juice.
Now I am talking to you from Tashkent, Uzbekistan,
Wow.
in Central Asia. I am a novelist, a memoirist, an essayist, a short story writer, a journalist. So mostly I'm a writer of all kinds. I do still miss theater and still dream perhaps someday I'll do a bit more theater. But I'm now a writer, and that is how I make a living. And weirdly enough, I've made more writing books than doing anything else I've ever done in my life. That's not how I expected things to turn out, but I took a bunch of strange turns in my life, and it ended up in a lot of places accidentally. So.
Yeah. So tell us about that. Tell us about some of those accidents. How did you go from Massachusetts to what? Where were you? Washington.
Right. So, all right.
Yeah. And then to Uzbekistan. Hopefully I said it right.
Yes. So there were a few stops in between, and I can make those really brief. But so I left Massachusetts at 15 to go to an alternative school in Vermont for my last couple of years of high school. It was on a farm. We got to shovel cow poop and have carrot day where we harvested carrots and do lots of art and singing as well as regular. So that was exciting. I loved that. That changed my life, that school, the Putney School.
Okay.
And then I went off to Oberlin for college and loved Oberlin, hated Ohio. I need mountains.
Wow.
Flatness doesn't do it for me. Also, I grew up on a coast, and it's hard for me to not be on a coast. I'm talking to you from a double landlocked country.
Right.
So I'm really far from a coast right now.
Yeah. Are there any mountains there where you are?
There's lots. Actually, there's some really spectacular mountains in this part of the world. In fact, Kyrgyzstan, which is one of our neighbors, we're surrounded by stands. There's 5 stands around us. In Kyrgyzstan, they call it the Switzerland of Central Asia.
Okay.
It has such high and stunning mountains. But Uzbekistan also has high and stunning mountains. So it has some spectacular scenery. Tashkent itself is flat, and it's a urban sprawl. It's perhaps not the most picturesque city I've lived in, but there are some incredibly picturesque cities in this part of the world. How did I get to that?
You were talking about the
landscape, Ohio.
Yeah.
Right. So when I left Ohio, I moved to Seattle to start my acting career. And then I moved after 4 years in Seattle. I ended up in some time in Missoula working with a theater company there. I did end up moving to New York City and lived in New York City for 12 years. And that's where I finished. I got an MFA in creative writing, realized I still hadn't published anything. I still had no teaching experience. I was probably going to be waitressing till the end of my days if I didn't do something that I could make a living at. And so I went to the Columbia University School of Journalism because I figured at least journalists get a paycheck. It may not be the biggest paycheck in the world, certainly when you're starting out in newspapers, but at least it's something. So I started out in newspapers and worked for small newspapers, at first in Massachusetts, then New Jersey, and then finally made my way back to the city. I missed theater so much that I quit newspapers to switch to magazines and briefly worked as an associate editor at Playgirl magazine, writing basically soft porn for a little while. Yeah, I know. I told you there were some interesting turns.
Yeah, how does somebody to get into that?
Well, all right.
You're a writer, so
yeah.
There's articles in there.
Yeah, actually, I wrote an essay about that time at Playgirl magazine that ran in the Podunk Review, which is a literary magazine out of New Orleans.
Okay.
It's called The Braille Machine, that essay. Okay. I believe it's probably online. Anyway, So I worked there. I worked for a friend of mine from graduate school. So there was a little bit of nepotism, but they still made me work quite hard to get that job. I had to write pitches and write stories and go through interviews. And it was an incredibly rigorous hiring process. And I had a lot of fun working there. I learned a lot of interesting things, but was eventually fired. So for lack of respect for authority, which again is kind of its own story.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to include these things because no one's road is really linear, and you don't just succeed at everything along the way. There's turns. I was really sad when I was fired because I was planning to write this terrific expose about writing for Playgirl magazine.
Oh, wow. Okay. Did you ever did you ever do it?
No, I mean, I've
after you leave.
Yeah. I had to make do with just the essay, and I took a course in Manhattan in one-woman performance art at some point, and started doing a short performance piece based just on getting fired from Playgirl that I did at a couple open mics in New York.
Wow, okay.
I don't know what happened to that script, but anyway, so that was fun.
I know. I was going to say, where can we find it? Where can we see the taping of it? Where can we check it out?
This was a long time ago. So
before Facebook and cell phones and
right. I'm a late adapter of technology, so I didn't have a cell phone till pretty late. So I worked briefly at a couple other magazines before I ended up at The Week, which is a news magazine based in New York. And I helped launch it already existed in the UK, and it was very successful over there. It's still very successful over there. And they wanted to launch it in the US, and I was one of the original hires to help do that. So I started off as a science and health writer. Those are special interests of mine. And I've been doing a lot of health writing for the newspaper in New Jersey. I'd won an award for my health writing. So I think that's why they hired me. Or maybe they just hired me because my boss knew I'd been working at Playgirl, and he was like, so what was that like?
Yeah.
But anyways,
those older projects that you have sometimes get you into the new ones.
It's true. Because my professors from journalism school said, whatever you do, don't tell anyone you worked at Playgirl. Take it off your CV.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. They said it's going to make you look illegitimate as a journalist. You need to take it off. And then I seriously do think when I had my job interview at The Week, that's what they were most interested in talking with me about.
Wow.
And I thought, if it weren't for that, I don't know, maybe they wouldn't have hired me.
Right.
Maybe it made me look more interesting. And I think also the fact that one of the editors who interviewed me had worked for Penthouse, I think.
Okay.
So we had porn in common.
Yes.
Just a weird thing to say about people you write in a news magazine for. But anyway.
How'd you get your job? We had porn in common.
Yeah,
Don't you? Yeah. That's a story. Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. So I worked there for the longest I worked anywhere that required semi-regular hours. And it was a good job. It was a good job. I learned a lot because I was writing about something different every day. I was reading scientific studies, I was reading health studies, and eventually I was allowed to also write the film page and then the theater page. And so I picked up extra pages as I stayed there longer and got promoted. And in 2006, I was still working for The Week, and a friend of mine from high school, my high school boyfriend, wrote to me from Yemen and said, how would you like to come from Yemen?
Okay.
Right.
Wow.
And said, how would you like
did you say, when he wrote to you, did you know he was there, or were you like, you're where? You're doing what?
I did not know he was there. I was not surprised to hear from him because we've been in touch off and on since high school. So he was just one of those people that kept popping in and out of my life. And I think the reason he contacted me in this specific instance is that at the time he didn't know any other journalists, and he knew I was working as a journalist, and he had done a little bit of writing for the Yemen Observer, which is this Yemeni-owned newspaper in Sana'a, Yemen. And he realized pretty quickly that no one at the newspaper had any training in journalism.
Okay.
And so he wrote to me and said, would you be willing to move to Yemen and train these journalists? And I said, well, hang on. I have a rent stabilized apartment and healthcare. I can't just run off to Yemen. I don't even know anything about Yemen. I had no plan to move to Yemen. I didn't speak Arabic. I'd never been to the Middle East or Arabia or anywhere in the region.
Yes.
So, but at the same time, I was also intrigued because again, I'd always had these fantasies about living abroad. But when I thought about it, I thought about, oh, I'm going to be like Henry Miller, Anais Nin, and I'm going to go live in Paris. And of course, those people were supported financially by other people.
Right.
And I was living alone in Manhattan, supporting myself. So not on a salary that could, afford me a very fancy life in Paris. So
Right.
that hadn't happened. And so Yemen wasn't in my plans, but Yemen was being offered to me. And so I said, look, I've got 3 weeks vacation left this year. What if I just came for 3 weeks and did a training for the journalists of the paper? Would that help at all? And he spoke to the owner of the paper who said, yes, please come.
Okay.
So I got on a plane with my Learn Arabic in 10 minutes a day workbook.
Too bad you didn't have those apps they have now where you could translate as you talk. But yeah.
Yeah, I really could have used that the first year, but I might not have learned as much Arabic as I did.
Exactly. Yeah.
So, I mean, I learned some basics before I went, please, thank you, and then numbers, because money is important and being able to argue with taxi drivers is very important. So, and you also have to learn how to say, that's crazy, I'm not paying that. That is a very important phrase.
Do you remember how to say it?
Majnoon is crazy. So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's fairly not super complicated to get the American tongue to say. Okay.
Right. Yeah, that wasn't one of the more difficult words. There are kind of 3 letters that all sound like gra to me, but I got better. I did end up, well, you'll see. You'll see. I don't want to give anything away.
All right. Keep going. Yeah.
So I went to Yemen, and it was, first of all, the city of Sana'a, the old city of Sana'a, is hands down the most beautiful place I have ever seen. I've never seen a city. It looked like it came out of a fairy tale.
Wow.
The buildings are, they look like, gingerbread houses. If you make them out of like dark gingerbread and then you have like white frosting on the edges, and picture those gingerbread houses stacked up tall, but with stained glass windows.
Wow. Okay.
And I mean, they were exquisite houses. And so I was stunned by the beauty of the city, but even more stunned by the people of Yemen, who were the world's friendliest people. I had never been anywhere in my life that was so hospitable and so friendly and so welcoming. And everywhere I went, people would say to me, "We love you. Welcome to Yemen." I mean, I'd just be walking down the street and they would and they'd be like, "We love you. Welcome to Yemen." And they would mean it. They would be very sincere about it. Yeah. And I thought this was wonderful. I suddenly had the experience of what it must be like to, be Julia Roberts or something.
Yeah.
And so my reporters were pretty amazing people. They were ambitious. They were curious. They had a million questions for me. They were both male and female. They were probably evenly divided between men and women. And I pretty much knew nothing about their culture or their country. So they were constantly teaching me about Yemen, about their culture. They were helping me with Arabic homework because I started studying Arabic right away. And I loved working with them. And at the end of those 3 weeks, which were so exciting, and I felt kind of invigorated in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt useful in a way that I didn't feel in New York, because in New York, there were dozens of journalists, probably more than dozens, who could have done my job perfectly well. Whereas these Yemeni journalists didn't have anyone else to help them. They wanted me to help them. And when it came time for me to leave, they didn't want me to go. And the owner of the newspaper said, the staff really likes you. I like what you're doing with the newspaper. Would you be willing to take over as editor-in-chief for a year? And this is what he says, which still makes me laugh, and turn it into the New York Times. And I thought, okay, like there's no way.
There you go. Challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, that's a real challenge. I said, well, I've never worked at the New York Times, and what are you prepared to pay me? And which was about $12,000 for the year. And I said, well, that's a little bit less than I make in Manhattan. And he said, well, but you won't even come close to spending that here. It's impossible. I mean, at the time, everything in Yemen was so inexpensive. He said, $12,000, you'll live like royalty, which is true.
Wow.
I know. So I said, well, I'll think about it, but I don't know if I can swing it. So I went back to New York, and then I went back to the office. Same gray walls, same cubicle, same colleagues, and
perspective completely shifted, I'm sure. Yeah. Things don't look the same anymore. Yeah.
No. And I thought, and the other thing was that no one was very curious to hear about Yemen. And I thought, why aren't people interested? They don't know anything about Yemen. They've never been there. And yet no one had any questions for me. And I thought, that's it. I'm moving to Yemen. And so I went in the conference room, used the company phone to call Yemen.
Yeah.
This is before Zoom.
Yeah.
And I called Yemen and I said, if that job's still open, I can be there in 2 weeks. And
wow. Just Yemen. Like that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so that was what changed everything for me. Moving to Yemen changed everything.
Okay. And tell us in what way? How did that change? How did that change you, and what happened?
Okay. So first of all, running that newspaper was the most difficult thing I'd ever done. I was completely unprepared for the challenge. But there's no way to learn how to run a newspaper better than running a newspaper or, struggling to run a newspaper and then eventually figuring it out. So, there's all these things that took me a while to figure out. So I learned a great deal professionally, also culturally, kept learning Arabic and all that. So, but I was working kind of insane hours until my boss took me aside at one point and said, look, you need to, he's like, I don't want 100% from you. I want maybe 60% right now, because if you keep going at the rate you're going, you're going to burn out and leave me. And I don't want you to leave. So if you could work a little less. And I said, but the paper has to come out. And if I work a little less, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it was a year of really steep learning for me, all uphill. But fast, like never a dull moment. It was a fascinating time. I got to meet such incredible people. I loved working with my journalists. We'd get in, screaming arguments, and then the next day we'd be best friends. So it was just, we had a relationship that was ultimately productive. But towards the end of that year, when I was beginning to think about what I was going to do when this year was up, I met the man who would become my husband. And so
does that change everything or what? Yeah.
Yeah. So that changed things. So I met him at the French ambassador's house in his garden on Bastille Day. So we never forget the day we met, because it happens to be a French holiday. And
is he French too?
No, he's British, actually. Okay. He was the British ambassador to Yemen and had just arrived when we met. And it was his first ambassadorial posting. So I met him, and our daughter was eventually born while we lived in Yemen. And my first book, which was the memoir about my experiences running the newspaper, was published while I lived in Yemen. So Yemen gave me this incredible experience running the newspaper. It helped me sell my first book. I found my husband, and I had my daughter. So I'm really not sure what more I could have wanted from that particular pivot. I mean, this was not what I anticipated when I left the US. In fact, when I left the US, I was 37. When I met my husband, I was 38. When I left the US, I said to my gynecologist, I don't know if I want children, because I didn't. I wasn't sure. But I thought, do I really want to rule it out? And I assumed that moving to Yemen was ruling out a romantic life and children because I couldn't really see myself meeting a life partner there. And it wasn't supposed to be a long-term thing, just 1 year.
Yeah.
And my gynecologist was like, I can't make your decisions for you. I think you're nuts, but do what you want to do.
Yeah.
So I did not think that any of this would happen. And 3.5 years into our time in Yemen, when I was living with my husband and I was 6.5 months pregnant, I ended up getting kidnapped at gunpoint by 8 armed men. And for a day, it was just a day, but the day feels long when you don't know if you're going to survive it. And then my husband ended up getting attacked by a suicide bomber on his way to work. So there were some less exciting things that happened. But my first novel, The Ambassador's Wife, was actually inspired by that kidnapping. So that book begins with a kidnapping that's similar to how mine happened, but then takes off in a completely fictional direction.
Okay. Now, did they take you because they thought you were from a wealthy family or assumed that you had a lot of money? It's not like that. Okay.
No, this was this was not terrorist. This was purely opportunistic. And actually, I think more than opportunistic, I mean, they were trying to negotiate something in some kind of ransom for our release. But of course, the Brits don't pay ransom, so that doesn't work. I mean, the man who took us hostage was clearly not, I think he suffered from mental illness. Because when I was trying to speak with him and trying to explain who we were, he didn't see me. He just didn't see me. And, when you look in someone's eyes and you can kind of tell they are not there and and that you don't register. And I didn't register with him. And it was a really terrifying moment because I thought he doesn't see me as a human. Yeah. But we did, ultimately we did get out of that situation. But we were in Yemen for 4 years. So, it's a lot longer than I originally intended on staying. And actually, when we left, I was devastated. We only left because we were evacuated. My daughter and I were evacuated. My husband had to stay and finish his posting.
Wow. And so after you were evacuated, you came back to the States? You went to Britain? Where did you end up next?
Well, so we didn't have a home anywhere else. So I didn't have a home anywhere else. And my husband had just been through a divorce. And so he no longer had a home.
You didn't want to show up there. Hi.
Right. So we went to Jordan and rented an apartment because we wanted to be within a direct flight to my husband because I had a 6-month-old baby and I wasn't all that keen on being alone with her. And so we were there, but it was only 4 months. And then we were reunited in London. So we spent 2 years together, maybe almost 2 years together in London before my husband was posted to Bolivia. And then we all moved there together and spent 4 years in Bolivia.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Which is a whole different part of the world, different language, different culture, different everything. Also fabulous. And
were you still writing there? Did you keep doing your work or were you just being mom or what were you doing there in Bolivia?
I don't think I've ever just been a mom. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just I'm not sure I'm capable of it. I mean, when my daughter was 2 weeks old, I was alone with her in London. My husband was in Yemen. I was living in someone's basement, but that's when I started writing again because I just couldn't.
You had to.
So much of infants is just mindless diaper changing. But I was
from sleeping to diaper changing to eating to sleeping to And
I just needed something else to do, and I just didn't know what else to do other than write stuff. And so, and I started The Ambassador's Wife. Yeah, I must have started The Ambassador's Wife already. That took me about 5 years to research and write that book. And so I finished writing The Ambassador's Wife in Bolivia, and began, and actually got the idea for Exile Music, my latest book. I got the idea for that early on in our time in Bolivia because that book is set largely in Bolivia, also in Vienna, but Vienna and Bolivia.
Okay.
So there was also a book in between, just because I want to include the little missteps along the way. There was a book set in New York that I wrote between The Ambassador's Wife and Exile Music that my agent didn't like, and that happens sometimes.
Okay. Right.
So,
oh my goodness. I can't even imagine doing it. Well, I guess I can imagine doing a project, but writing a book for 5 years, that's a lot of dedication, perseverance. I mean, did you ever get to a point where you were like, oh my gosh, can this be done? When you're doing anything, I don't know. I've never written a book, so maybe you're so passionate about it and you're so in the story that it's just like you coming out on the pages. I don't know. What is that like, writing a book?
there are many points where I get incredibly impatient. And I think,
Okay.
why did someone who is as impatient a human as I am,
Right.
pick book writing? Because I'm not a patient person. I mean, I can't even stand on an escalator. I have to keep moving. And yet, it takes 5 years to get a book written, researched and written. And I do find if I'm writing a rough draft, I can kind of steam along.
Mhm.
And that part of it isn't hard for me because there's so much momentum in that. But most of the real writing happens in the rewrites and the millions of drafts that I end up writing
Okay.
to shape the story and make it, make every detail add up to the ending and contribute to it. And so those rewrites can feel endless, although I actually really enjoy that phase too. But once you are working with an editor at a publishing company, and then there's months in between edits and you're just waiting. And then even when the book is done
Yeah.
and they tell you, oh, it's going to be 18 months till it comes out. And you want to be like, are you kidding me?
I know.
No.
No, that's not how it's going to work.
Right.
I give you a month. Yeah, that's even harder than having a baby, because at least the 9 months, and then somewhere around the 9th month we'll be delivering.
Right. They're not,
Yeah.
There's no chance that pregnancy is going to end up being, 24 months.
Yeah, sorry, ma'am. You're just gonna 18 months more. You'll be No one would have babies at that point.
Nope, they would not.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. So I'm 2 questions. When you were in Bolivia, you learned the language.
I
So you
did.
learned another language.
I
Okay.
did.
And how
And it was
is it? Is it hard? Is it when you're there, you just immerse into it and just your brain just switches? How?
Well, it's not. I mean, it's. I took actual classes in both
Okay.
Yemen and Bolivia, the whole 4 years in both countries. So by the time
Okay.
I left Yemen, I had passably conversational Arabic, which I've probably all forgotten by now, but I managed pretty well when I was out on my own.
Yeah.
And in Bolivia, Spanish is much easier for me anyway, a much
Right.
easier language. So I learned. It was a little depressing to me that after 3 months of Spanish, my Spanish was where my Arabic had been, like, after 4 years. But I love Spanish. I love speaking Spanish. I miss it. It's such a fun language. And of course, it's really useful in the US as well.
Yes.
When I went back to New York, I thought, oh my gosh, this whole world just opened up to me that I couldn't hear before I learned Spanish. Now I understand more people on the subway. And
when they're walking by, or when you're in the, I don't know, Starbucks or whatever, wherever you go. Yeah,
Right.
on the subway. Cool. Very
Right.
cool.
The best language teacher is necessity. You just have to find a way to ask for things and find your way. And like in Yemen, I had to take taxis, and I had to take taxis alone. So I had to learn how to talk to taxi drivers. That was my
your first course.
Yeah.
So along this path of all these different places you lived, who helped you? I know you ran the paper and you just learned as you went, but did you have a mentor? Did you have people you reached back to? Did you have people who helped you? Tell us about some of those people who may have helped you along the way.
Okay, so I'll tell you a few people who helped me in critical ways. So I had a journalism professor at the Columbia School of Journalism, who gave me my first assignment as a reporter while I was still a student of hers. So I worked really hard at Columbia. It's a 1-year master's program, but no one eats or sleeps. It's super rigorous, and you're on the streets every day, and you have a beat, and you're turning in stories every day, and it was tough. And I was working incredibly hard. And in spring of that year, she called me up and said that Time Magazine needed some reporting on campus about. It was right after the death of Bill Cosby's son, and Time Magazine was doing a piece on his death. Okay. And so I ended up finding, I'm trying to remember who exactly the source was, a kid that studied with him because his son had been at the teacher's college studying there. So anyway, I had my first byline was in Time Magazine, which was kind of exciting for me.
That's pretty cool.
As a little baby reporter. And she also, she was eccentric in, for example, smoking was against the rules in the building, but she would teach her classes leaning out the window, rolling her own cigarettes. Anyway, she was a character. But she, when I was applying for internships, I applied for an internship at the Patriot Ledger in Massachusetts, and she called them up and said, if you take Jennifer and she doesn't work out, I will repay every penny you've spent on her salary.
Okay.
So they offered me the position.
Somebody believes you in you like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I felt a little nervous about that, but anyway,
right.
so that's Carol. She really did help me at Columbia. She was a real supporter. And I needed one because I was one of the most inexperienced people in my class. A lot of these people were mid-career journalists. They already had a ton of experience and I'd never done anything. So I was grateful. And then my friend Tom Zollner, who is an utterly brilliant nonfiction writer, he'd written a few books by the time we met at a cocktail party in Manhattan at some point, and we became really close friends. He visited me in Yemen, and he read the book proposal that I wrote for my first book, the one about running the newspaper, and gave me a few suggestions, a few edits, and then said, I wasn't planning on sharing my agent with anyone, but this is so up her alley that I feel compelled to share this proposal with my agent. Nice. And that was incredibly generous of him as a writer, because sharing an agent is like sharing a parent, and you're always worried that you are not the favored child.
Yes. They'll forget about me. Now they got you.
Exactly. Yeah. Because we'll be like, is she returning your emails? I haven't heard from her. But in a fun way, because we're still friends. But so he really helped me. I don't know where I'd be. I would be nowhere without my agent. So he hooked me up with her, and she rang me in Yemen and said, I want to represent this book.
Nice. Wow. Okay. And so if you were to run into yourself in Yemen or in Massachusetts or in New York, and you were a younger woman, what would you advise her? What piece of advice would you give her, your younger self?
Right. The one thing that I think about all the time is I wish I had been easier on my body or better at looking after it, because I've always been an obsessive athlete, but not necessarily in a healthy way. So like when I was a runner, I ran 7 days a week, which is, at least for my particular body, doesn't work. And it kept falling apart. It kept telling me, this is too much. This is too much. And various parts of me broke. And this has happened with every sport I've ever done. And so I just wish I'd listened to my body and if you're in pain, don't do the same thing every day. Don't just keep, look, it matters, now that I have terrible kind of spinal problems and nerve pain because of not doing that. So that's one piece of advice. The other piece of advice I would give is take risks, put yourself in situations that terrify you, right. in places where every assumption you have about the world is challenged, and you will learn things. It wasn't until I moved to Yemen that I even began to unpack the ways in which growing up in the US had shaped me and shaped my assumptions about the world and how it works.
Yes. Yes. That's a really good one. Yeah. I wish we could all travel somehow. I always said I wish that I could have sent my children even to some of the, you wouldn't want them to get hurt, but even to some of the worst parts of the world to just see, what? Life is really not that hard. The way at least they had it when they were growing up. And then just to see there's, we tend to have a little bit of an insulated point of view. And I'm not talking about anything in particular, just like you said, I don't even think I can grasp what you're saying because I haven't really experienced it to that extent, but you can see how it's just opens you up in whole different ways.
Right. There's so many things you notice when you're outside. Yeah.
Yeah. Viewpoints. And even the architecture you were talking about, the buildings. I mean, I'm trying to picture the gingerbread houses on top of each other, and I'm still seeing gingerbread houses on top of each other. But just to see it, and even to go from a city to a place where there are mountains, you see it on TV, but real life is just a whole different experience,
Right. So when I was living in Yemen, my reporters were appalled by the fact that I lived alone, because no one in Yemen lives alone. No one. They wouldn't want to. They're horrified at the thought of living alone because they are so devoted to their family and their community and their tribe. And it's kind of in that order: family, then community, then and I loved that. Like I loved that, they always childcare wasn't an issue. There was always someone to look after a child. There was always, someone to do the cooking or help with the cooking. It never occurred to me, I came from Manhattan where like 52% of adults live alone, so it didn't seem weird, but to them, they were like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. This is terrible.
Yeah.
You want to come stay with us?"
Wow. Okay. Did you end up staying? You stayed alone, or did you end up staying with others?
Well, I did stay alone, but the funny thing is, when I loved living alone in New York, and so I thought I always would want to do that. But in Yemen, what ended up happening is it started that with coming home one day and finding a sobbing German woman on my stairs who'd just been thrown out of her home. And so I said, "Well, you can come live with me." And so she did. And then and I loved living with her, and I got really used to having someone else around. And then I invited another German woman to live with me, and then a Dutch woman, and then a second Dutch woman, and then
an artist, all at the same time.
A Scottish woman. No, there was some overlap. Like there was a long period where I lived with a Scottish woman who was 12 years older and a Dutch woman who was 12 years younger, and I was right in the middle of them, and that was great.
Yeah.
It was great. It was so nice. I'd forgotten it was nice to come home from work and there'd be people.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you could talk to them. And
now, did you keep pictures of these times when you traveled in Yemen and had these roommates and the paper? And I'm just picturing, I can picture the movie.
Oh yes. I have
a movie.
Well, I would love that.
Yes.
I would love that. And yes, I have a ton of photos. I have photos of all my reporters. I'm still in touch with all my Yemeni reporters.
That's good. And so everyone is doing well. And is the paper still running?
No. I mean, the country's been in the middle of civil war.
Right. Yeah.
But my star reporter was a woman named Kokub, who in a way, although she considers me her mentor, in a way she's mine, because she would want to come with me to the grocery store, and I'd say, "Kokub, I know how to say these words in Arabic." And she'd be like, "No." And I'd be like, "I'm old enough to be your mother." And she said, "Mothering is a feeling. It is not an age. And I'm coming with you. And I'm making sure that, you get the."
Oh, all right. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
she's a feeling. Okay.
Yeah. And so she mothered me, and she married a human rights lawyer and fled the country because of death threats to him. Okay. And she's now a refugee in Turkey. So, and I saw her last year in Istanbul.
Okay. And does she tell you about that and how that feels? I always, because we read about refugees and civil wars, and I can't even imagine how that feels. I don't want to be somewhere else, but I have no choice to be somewhere else. How is she doing with that emotionally and culturally and physically? It's got to be just devastating in a level I can't imagine.
Yes, that
Yeah.
is certainly true. She is an unbelievably competent and ambitious. She's a fiery person. She gets things done. She
Yeah.
doesn't, she's not the kind of person who sits around bewailing her outcast state. She just gets on with things. And
Okay.
I mean, she also, I mean, she now has 3 children, but because she was her husband's second wife, because in Yemen you can take 4,
Okay.
and she had never wanted to be a second wife. You know, most women, in fact, I never met a woman who wanted there to be any other wives.
Hmm.
But
That's an
the
interesting
men,
thought because I
yeah,
always wondered if in those places where you can have multiple wives, if they're just good with it. That's oh well.
they were
Okay.
not good with it.
Okay.
And this is anecdotal evidence. These are not statistics, but the
Right.
women I know, not good with it. There's jealousy and
Yeah.
you know, you're time sharing a husband, and it's, I mean, she's alone right now in Istanbul with 3 kids.
Yeah.
And if she didn't have her sister with her, you know, she would really struggle to both work and parent, because her husband is now in the Netherlands because he couldn't get a job in Istanbul. So he went to Netherlands, and he's trying to get her to join him. But, you know, it was hard enough getting a visa for the first
First
wife.
wife. Yeah, they're
But
like,
imagine,
yeah. The second wife, what is that? We don't really understand. Yeah.
yeah, or the third. I think
Yeah.
we would be like, come on, what are you running over there?
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, so I think it is quite tough. I think her life is quite tough, but she's a tough person.
Okay.
She has been through things, and um, yeah, I love her.
Oh,
She's amazing.
yeah. Could teach some lessons in how to be, I don't know, maybe you you rise to whatever your challenges are. Because I was going to say maybe she can teach some of us how to build that strength, but maybe that's something you have to build when you go through it. I don't know. Some
Well,
people
I
have
don't
it,
know.
and some people,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Some people have natural resilience and some people don't. I mean, I think this interests me a lot. It comes up in my writing, but I mean, for
yeah.
her, she's certainly resilient. She um, does it a lot through work. She's resourceful about finding work for herself and finding meaningful work. So
Right.
you know, she's worked for the various UN organizations after working with me, but she also is working for a group to help Yemeni women, help empower Yemeni women. So even though she's not in Yemen, she's very passionate about women's
Okay.
rights and human rights, and a keen advocate for those. And, you know, she went and got a master's degree in Cairo at one point.
Okay.
So, and we actually crossed paths in Cairo too. It's funny. We've
Wow.
seen each other
Okay.
in 4 countries. Isn't that funny? It's crazy.
That's, yeah, like destiny or something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you, who also seem like a very resilient person, I mean, just being kidnapped when you're pregnant alone could send people into a hole that they just like, I'm scared and I'm not coming out of it. So eh, eh, tell us what is next for you.
Well, I just finished writing a new novel. It's very different. It
Okay.
is very dark and feministy and very queer and very underground and very South American. So I wrote this book as part of a PhD dissertation. I'm finishing, I hope, a PhD at the University of Birmingham in the UK.
Nice.
And so that's been really interesting. And so that book is with my agent at the moment. We have not sent it out yet, but I hope we will soon.
Okay.
And we'll see what happens with that. In the meantime, I had a pretty inspirational trip to various parts of Uzbekistan, Nukus, a village named Moynak, and what used to be the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea was once this vast body of water, huge, and Moynak was a fishing village with a massive fishing industry on the sea, with big fishing vessels and canning industries and all kinds of things. Anyway, that sea is now 10% what it used to be.
Wow.
And so that fishing village is now a 5-hour drive from what's left of the water, which is all polluted and over salinated and with no more fish. So I became very interested in kind of the environmental disaster and the change in the climate that's happened in that area. And at the same time, very interested in this art museum in Nukus called the Savitsky Museum, which I'm also really fascinated by because it's got its own exciting backstory. And so I'm setting a novel in that part of the world.
Wow.
I just sold a murder mystery set at the Aral Sea, and I've never written a mystery before. But I thought this sounds like a fun thing to do, and I wrote this murder mystery set there based on a prompt I found online, and I sent it off to a Canadian mystery magazine, and they wrote back and said, "We'll publish this."
And so those are a series of books, or what are those?
No, that's just a story.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a short story. It'll be in this Canadian mystery magazine. I was just kind of tickled because I'm not previously a mystery writer, but now I am. So
that's right. You're all around.
Yeah. So I guess that's my next project is the novel that's set in the Aral Sea, which will be different. Maybe there'll be a murder mystery. Maybe I should do that. I'll have to think about this and get back to you. But
okay. Yeah. And think about how that's going to go.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, thank you. Is there anything else you're going to be doing? You're going to be doing it from the same country? Are we going to be shifting to another one for this book? I mean, come on. How long have you been there?
I know.
I can move.
Well, you know what, though? We have been quite a lot because, all right, it's a 4-year posting that my husband has here. Okay. But after the first however many months, my daughter and I were evacuated at the start of the first COVID wave. So the British government evacuated us and sent us to London where we had nowhere to live. So we had to kind of scramble to find a flat. Wow. Anyway, I won't bore you with the whole story, but we ended up spending 5 months in London, just the two of us, and then 7 months in France, just the two of us. And then finally getting reunited with my husband after 11 months apart. And then so my daughter had COVID in London, and then I got it in France, and then gave it to my husband when he came to visit. So we all had it. But anyway, then we finally came back here. So actually, I feel like we've hardly been in Uzbekistan because we've had such an interrupted time, and I keep having to move around the world alone with my daughter. And you don't think when you marry a diplomat that you might end up living apart from him for 11 months. Right. So that's a challenge, and raising a child. Who's now 11 and amazing. So we will be here for 2 more years, and I hope there will be no more evacuations. So I'll have 2 more years to kind of dig around and travel as much as is possible given the pandemic.
Yeah, the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. But then after that, I mean, we do have a permanent home. We have a permanent home in France. We bought a house there while we were posted to Bolivia because we thought it would be good for our daughter to have somewhere that doesn't change, so that there's an anchor and so that we can leave stuff there and not have to pack it back up again. And so we've never lived there full time, but Theodore and I did live there for 7 months during the pandemic. So, so we're hoping to live there after this posting, but we'll have to see. A lot will depend on money, finances, jobs, that sort of thing.
Exactly.
Because I teach as well. And so I teach, I edit, I do other things. I mentor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Very cool. Does your daughter speak Spanish and English and any other language? That is amazing. That's such a gift.
She speaks French.
And French?
Yeah, she was in French schooling. Yeah, well, she was in French schooling her whole life, actually. I mean, she was in a Bolivian nursery school where she learned Spanish, and then a French school in Bolivia, which was partly in Spanish, partly in French, and then stayed in French education until this year. And she's currently in international school, in school in English for the first time, actually. So
Yeah. It's such a gift. I know friends, he was Spanish. His wife was French, and they lived in America, and their twins can speak all those three languages as if they are natives to the language. It's amazing.
I know
I am so
so
jealous because I'm
envious.
like,
I know, me too. I wish
yeah,
I'd grown up like that.
yeah. I think it's
Ah,
amazing. I love languages. So
yeah.
good for her. That'll be beneficial for her. She'll be able to move around naturally, learn languages probably easier, and make a choice of what country she wants to live in.
Yeah,
Are
I
you
will be.
nervous about that? That when she gets older, she might go way over there?
Yeah,
Might
I'm a
end up in
little.
China. You guys
Yeah,
haven't been to China yet?
I have no idea where she'll end up. She's unpredictable. She's
Okay.
learning Russian at the moment because we're here and they speak Russian and Uzbek and Tajik and a bunch of other languages, but because they're former Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But we keep asking her regularly what she thinks of as home.
Mhm.
Where do you think of as home? And it changes. The answer changes.
Okay.
So,
Yeah. She's young still, probably finding her ground.
yeah.
Neat. Yeah.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
weird. Like, I'm from the United States, but she's never lived there.
Yeah.
So
So,
she doesn't feel that American, I guess, but she is. She has a passport.
right. Yeah. So maybe she'll try it. Maybe she'll go to school there. Maybe she'll go to college and she'll be like, these people. What's wrong with you people?
That would require a
You
lot
only
of
speak
fun.
one language? What?
I know.
Very
Yeah.
nice. So, well, thank you so much for sharing your story, sharing your journeys, sharing your travels. And we can't wait to read your books, especially this new one that will wait a couple of years. We'll give you a couple of years because we know that
Yeah,
babies, those kind of babies take a little while. But
yeah, it could take a while.
yeah.
It's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you having me on your show.
Thank you. But before we go, I want a couple of questions.
Okay.
What is the best way for listeners to get in touch with you after this taping?
You can email me through my website, which is jennifersteil.net. So it's Jennifer, JenniferSteil.net. So you can find information on my books there. You can also find me on Twitter at JFSteil7, so JFSTEIL7. I'm also on Instagram. If you just look for my name, Jennifer Steil, or I think my Instagram handle is Jennifer F. Steil, I think, middle initial F. So you can contact me through any of those places, probably. But there is a way to email me through my website if you would like to do that.
Okay.
And yeah.
And then one other question, which I should have asked before, but what is one book? I know you've written a lot of books, but and it could be one of your books, but what is one book you would advise every woman to read?
So I had a really hard time thinking about this, because there are a lot of good books in the world. Yes. And it's hard, but so I've settled on one, which I was looking over just before we spoke. It's Maggie Nelson's book, The Argonauts, which I chose because it says such interesting and intelligent things about gender and identity and sexuality and parenthood and partnership and birth. I mean, a lot, and patriarchy and that sort of thing. And I just, every time I read her, I think one day maybe I could be that smart. She's just, she's pretty astonishing, Maggie Nelson. So the Argonauts. Yeah.
Good. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I did have one other question that I'm just going to ask you because why not? What's one thing that you can't miss doing every day?
Moving my body.
Okay.
And so at the moment, because I'm somewhat limited because of all my injuries, I do ballet every day.
Do you? I love ballet. Love ballet. Okay. Yeah. So you do it in a studio? You do it at home?
I do it at home. And it started, I used to be a dancer when I was young, and I was fairly kind of traumatized by a fascist teacher, how some of them can be.
Yes. Yes.
So, and also, I really wanted to be a professional ballet dancer at one point, but I do not have the body, the flexibility, the turnout, the extension, all the things you really
Yes.
need.
I wanted to be one too. Had nothing, none of the attributes,
No,
but I loved it so much. So yes,
I
I
know.
understand. Yeah.
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 Yeah. I started doing it when we were evacuated to London and we couldn't leave the house and I was bored with yoga. I was doing yoga every day and I thought I just need to do something. I feel like dancing. I want to dance. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do ballet because I did that. And so I tried like some jazz and some modern. And I was like, this is fun. This is okay. But then I took a ballet class and I thought, oh, but this is what I love. Like I love
Yeah.
this. And so, yeah, I just have found a bunch of ballet teachers online whose classes I really love and find that I can follow them. And even if it's just a ballet bar every day, it makes me feel like it's funny to be doing ballet and not be planning to be a dancer. There's something wonderful about it. Like I'm not going to be auditioning for the bullshit anytime soon, So there's like no pressure. I can just enjoy the movement and the music, the fact that you're moving to music, and that feels luxurious right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I am inspired because why not? Moving for yourself. And when I think back to dancing, it was almost like a spiritual thing. It just was so wonderful. But, like you said, you're thinking if you're not going to be a dancer for life, then you got to go find something else to do. But why not?
Yeah. I mean, I think that was my thought was, well, when I quit, that was it. You can never go back because you can't ever be a professional. If you're not going to be a professional, then forget it. And actually when we were in Bolivia and my little tiny daughter at the time was taking ballet and she actually got thrown out of a ballet school. Anyway, but we were looking for another ballet school for her and they had her audition for this one. I mean, she was 4 or something. She was little. And they looked at her like extension and her flexibility and they said, no, she's never going to be a dancer. Look at her. She has terrible flexibility, terrible extension. And I said,
oh gosh,
I don't care if she's ever a dancer. I just want her to have the experience of doing ballet. I don't care if she's a professional. That's not why she's going. She's 4.
Yeah. That's a different perspective as well. Yeah. Nice. Well, I am inspired. Do you wear ballet shoes? Do you put the ballet shoes on too? Or do you do the whole?
I do.
And the tights?
I ordered them. Well, no, I don't wear tights because
you just wear them. Okay.
Well, it's 100 degrees here, so Okay.
Yeah, it's a little hot for tights. Yeah, tights is a little overkill.
And because I'm doing it for myself alone, who cares if I'm wearing tights? I do wear the ballet shoes because they just help my feet look nice and they change how your feet move on the floor. I ordered them online. I just ordered a pair of basic ballet shoes and
that's so cool. I'm going to get myself a bar in the basement. I said I should I've been thinking about that, but I was like, oh, you're too old to do a ballet.
No, you are not too old. You are never too old. And you know what? I don't have a bar. I use a fireplace and an armchair.
Okay.
Like I don't have a proper bar. It doesn't matter as long as something you can
something to lean on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something. Well, you don't lean, but you rest, right?
Right. Rest gently and elegantly. Yeah. My daughter, she will occasionally, she doesn't actually make fun of me. She's quite nice about it. But if I'm doing a Swan Lake inspired bar, I'll be like, look, I'm a swan. And she'll say, you're not a swan. You are a crazy lady waving her arms.
I'm a swan in my mind and in my heart. So go back upstairs and do your homework.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. Well, thank you again so much for sharing and joining me. And
we'll
look forward to your book.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been so much fun talking to you.
You've been listening to the F50 Woman podcast. Join the F50 Woman movement and this diverse group of voices to help change the world one woman at a time. Why should you join at your age? Because we're not done yet.